Hello everyone, what is up? Welcome back to another episode of Killer Instinct, you guys. Thank you so much for joining me here today. If you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah and I am your host of Killer Instinct. Before we get started, make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That way you never miss an episode. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday and you're not going to want to miss it. We also upload the video version onto YouTube on Wednesdays as well, so make sure you are subscribed. Now, before we get into anything, if you are listening to this on the day that it is released, I wanted to say Merry Christmas to you all. For all of those who celebrate, happy holidays. And I just wanted to extend my love to you during this holiday season. I am so incredibly grateful for all of the support that you guys have provided me over the years, and am just feeling very grateful in this season of life and in, this month and on this day. I'm just very, very grateful for you. And I just wanted to take a second and say that before we jump in to today's episode. I also wanted to remind you that if you are not aware or have not been listening the past few weeks, if this is the first episode you're hearing, we have officially launched our Patreon. The Patreon includes 3 additional exclusive episodes every single month, as well as an exclusive live video that we do at the end of the month as well. So if you're interested in that, it is $10 a month and all links will be in the description box below. So you will always be able to check that out there as well. But with that being said, you guys, I am very excited to talk to you about today's case. Today's case truly is incredibly heartbreaking for a multitude of reasons. As you can tell by the title, today we are talking about the murders of Ed and Minnie Morin, and this case took place in 1985. It is oftentimes referred to as the Christmas Tree Farm murders for reasons you will soon see. But with that being said, let's jump right on into it. Now, this case takes place in an area called Ethel, Washington. Ethel is a small community in Lewis County, Washington. This is your doors unlocked, everybody knows everybody kind of place. People who have lived in Ethel have said it's really not even a town. They more so just refer to it as a community. It is an area of farmers and it's an extremely rural area. And during Christmas, it is a very exciting time. It's a very festive area. There's Christmas parades. You have the Christmas tree farms. Everyone is coming together at this time of celebration. Ed and Minnie Morin were a part of those who were the Christmas tree farmers in Ethel, Washington. Ed was born on June 11th, 1904 in Lewis County, Washington, and Minnie was actually born on Christmas Day. Her birthday was December 25th, 1901, and she was born in Roseland, Nebraska. Now, Minnie did have multiple children from a previous marriage, but then married Ed, and the two lived on an 120-acre farm in Ethel. Ed and Minnie really were the pillars of their community. They had so many friends in Ethel. They had this huge family, and all of their family lived in Ethel as well. Minnie and Ed were always known to be the couple that was throwing parties and putting on different gatherings at their home. They were always having the get-togethers. They were always having people over. They were so inviting. And that really was no different on December 19th, 1985. On this particular day, Minnie was throwing a luncheon for her church group at her home. The luncheon was set to begin around noon. However, when people began to arrive, they realized very quickly that no one was home. They started knocking. There was no one coming to the door to answer. And this was definitely very uncommon for the Morins. They were always very dependable. They were always very punctual, and when they said that they were going to do something, they always did. So people did begin to become concerned when they were arriving to the home and no one was there. Now, the guests that were arriving ended up being so concerned that they ended up reaching out to some family members of Ed and Minnie, who quickly rushed over to the home. Ed and Minnie were 84 and 81 years old at the time, so there was a concern of, did something health related happen to them? Were they stuck inside of the home for some reason and unable to come to the door? So the family members rushed over to the home, and two family members actually walked around to the back of the house and ended up breaking a window to gain entry. Once they were inside, they walked through the home and noticed that Ed and Minnie were actually not inside at all, and they also noticed that their car was not in the driveway either. Now, these two things combined led them to believe it was possible that they had left the home to go pick something up. Maybe they forgot something at the store. But as time continued to go on and the time period of the luncheon had passed and there was still no sign of them, family members decided to contact the police that evening to file a missing persons report for Ed and Minnie. Police arrived to the home at approximately 6 p.m. on December 19th, and they did a walkthrough of the house, and they did notice some things that stood out to them. The first was that Minnie's purse was actually found tucked behind the couch. It was tucked behind the living room couch and had a piece of newspaper laying on top of it. This was odd for a multitude of reasons. First being that this is not somewhere that you typically would see a purse, but also Minnie always carried her purse with her everywhere she went. So it was odd that she would leave that behind. Now, along with that, Ed also had a watch that he always wore. He wore this watch every single day. He wouldn't leave the house without it, but that watch was left on the dresser in the bedroom as well. Additionally, in Ed and Minnie's bathroom, police noticed that there was a box that contained some bank statements, and those bank statements were scattered around the bathroom floor, which seemed odd. And when police walked outside of the home as well, they noticed that there were more bank statements found in the fireplace cleanout, which again was outside of the home. Having these bank statements sprawled out on the floor and in the fireplace cleanout outside, this definitely raised some alarms. But aside from those several things that police noticed, there didn't seem to be anything else wrong in the home. And what I mean by that is that there was no sign of a break-in, there was no sign of a robbery, there was no sign of forced entry, and police wondered if it was possible that Ed and Minnie just forgot that that day specifically was the day of the luncheon. They had to question if it was possible that they mixed up the dates and got the dates wrong. But again, family and friends were convinced that that was just unlike them. Police ended up checking with local hospitals. They were driving around surrounding neighborhoods, but no one was able to locate Ed and Minnie. Now, by later that night on December 19th, word had gotten around about Ed and Minnie's disappearance, and police had advised everyone to be on the lookout for Ed and Minnie's car. And by the following morning on December 20th, because so many people had heard about it, again, this was a small town and everyone knew Ed and Minnie, so everyone wanted to help. And by the following morning, which was the 20th, there was an employee of a Yardbird shopping center who called in and said that a car matching the description of Ed and Minnie's was found in the back of their parking lot. Now, at this time, this Yardbird store was very popular. Police say that it was equivalent to what a Walmart or a Target would be now. So when they got this call, police drove out to the store and they saw the car and they looked at the license plate, and the license plate on the car in the parking lot was a match to the license plate on Ed and Minnie's car. And not only was that a match, but the make and model were the same as well. So they were able to confirm that this was in fact their car. Now, the windows on this car were frozen over at the time because of the temperatures outside. So detectives ended up wiping the windows down, and when they did that, they uncovered a horrifying scene. Inside of the car was an absolute bloodbath. There was blood soaked into the seats, there was blood on the doors, there was blood on the steering wheel. It was everywhere. Inside of the car, they also saw a woman's shoe. It was a white sneaker looking type of shoe. That shoe was found on the floorboard. There was also a hat on the floorboard as well. There was a red blanket on the seats of the car that was just covering up more blood. And there were multiple shell casings found inside of the vehicle as well. What was missing from this car was Ed and Minnie. Now, the front door of this car was actually opened, so police were able to open the car up and they saw that the keys were actually still in the ignition of the car. They then opened the trunk to see if it was possible that there was anybody in the trunk, but the trunk was empty. So now police have one piece to this puzzle. They have the car, but honestly, the car left them with more questions than answers. And along with that, it made them absolutely horrified for Ed and Minnie themselves. It was very clear that something horrible had happened in this car, and that made police fear the worst for Ed and Minnie. Now, the car was then towed to the evidence garage after it was found, and it was canvassed for fingerprints. However, there was no fingerprints found in the vehicle other than Ed's and Minnie's. Now, back at Ed and Minnie's home, police continued to canvass the home, and they were walking through to see if they could gather any additional fingerprints or DNA that could have been left behind. Now, like I said earlier, something that really stood out to police was the bank statements that were in the bathroom and the fireplace cleanout. Now, because of this, police actually contacted Ed and Minnie's bank. They wanted to see if maybe there was a reason that these bank statements were laid out. And when they did that, they were told that Ed had come into the bank on the day of his disappearance. Ed went into his bank on December 19th, and he withdrew a substantial amount of cash. According to the teller, Ed had called his bank at approximately 10 a.m. on December 19th and asked them to prepare a withdrawal of $8,500 in cash. Now, an hour later, Ed arrived to the bank and told the teller that he was helping a family member purchase a car, and that is what he needed the cash for. The teller then handed him a bag of the cash, and Ed left. Now, because of this, police decided to get in contact with some of the Morin's family and asked if any of them were made aware of Ed and Minnie purchasing a car as a Christmas present or for someone in the family, but no one knew about this at all, which really raised suspicion for police and led them to believe that someone forced Ed to withdraw the money and threatened him to not tell anyone the real reason why, so he used the car excuse as a cover-up. So at this point in the investigation, several days had passed with no new developments in the case. But on Christmas Eve, police received a phone call from a man who said that he had been driving down a back road off of Stearns Hill, which was about 11 miles from where Ed and Minnie lived. And this man said that while he was driving down this back road, he thought he saw what appeared to be a mannequin in a ditch. He said that that was his first thought when he saw this, but he decided to stop his car and take a closer look. The man said that when he stopped his car and got out to confirm what it was, once he got a closer look, he realized that this was not a mannequin at all, and that in fact, this was a body. The man said he immediately called police, who rushed over to the scene. And when police first got there, they were able to confirm that this body was in fact the body of a female who appeared to have suffered from a gunshot wound, which was what police had anticipated had happened to Ed and Minnie based off of the evidence that they discovered in the car with the shell casings. Surrounding the woman's body was a 29-foot trail of blood, and at the end of this trail of blood, police discovered a pair of false teeth, so like dentures essentially. They also found glasses and a comb. Police then decided to continue walking down this road, and not too far from where the female body was discovered, they found another body, and this time it was the body of a male. Both bodies had appeared to be dragged to where they were found because the clothes that they were wearing had risen up on their bodies. Now, police were confident just based off of first look that unfortunately they had found the bodies of Ed and Minnie Morin. However, what really confirmed it to them was the white tennis shoe. There was a white tennis shoe lying right next to Minnie's body, and that same tennis shoe pair was a match to the other one that was discovered in Ed and Minnie's car. The bodies were transported to the medical examiner's office, and it officially confirmed through DNA that the bodies belonged to 81-year-old Ed and 84-year-old Minnie. They both were killed from a singular gunshot wound to the back of the head, and the bullet matched the shell casings that were found inside of the car. Now, as far as the investigation goes, police got the results back on the fingerprints that were taken from the home, and they learned that the only fingerprints that were found were those of Ed, Minnie, and family members themselves. So, because of that, and because of the fact that 80% of homicides are committed by someone that the victim knows, whether that be a family member or friend, that's who police looked to first. Police were going through each and every one of Ed and Minnie's family members simply just for precaution and protocol. They wanted to leave no stone left unturned. Now, meanwhile, there was a press release about the case that was broadcasted throughout Lewis County, and police urged anyone who had seen or heard anything about the case to call in, and that is exactly what people did. Police received multiple tips from people who claimed to have seen a man leaving the Morans' car on the afternoon of the disappearance at the Yardbird store where the car was later found. Like I said, this was a popular store, so there were people around at that time. Now, multiple people claim that they witnessed a white male between the ages of 20 and 30 getting out of the car. The man had brown hair, he was wearing a camouflage jacket, and he was holding an object wrapped in a towel that appeared to be a gun. Now, based off of these tips, police were able to hire a composite sketch artist who was able to create an image of what the potential suspect could have looked like based off of these reports. And that image, that composite sketch, was broadcasted onto the evening news. Now, this image being broadcasted, this composite sketch being out there, this prompted thousands of tips to be called in. But one tip in particular really stood out to police. And that tip was that the man in the composite sketch looked very, very similar to a man who just so happened to be involved in petty crime throughout Lewis County. And that man also just so happened to be the grandson of Ed and Minnie, and that man was named Mike Hadler. Now, Mike's father was named Dennis, who was Minnie's son and Ed's stepson. Now, Mike was not a stranger to law enforcement at all over the years. Like I said, he was involved in petty crime. One time he had stolen a considerable amount of money out of his father's safe. So he got brought in and questioned by authorities because, again, police were already questioning whether or not these murders were carried out by someone who was a family member of Ed and Minnie. So police were adamant about getting Mike in to the station to question him. And when they did, Mike denied having absolutely anything to do with his grandparents' murder. He actually went on to tell law enforcement that on December 19th, he was with his dad that morning on the way to work, and he passed his grandparents' home. Mike said that it was really early in the morning when they drove by their home, but one thing he noticed was that Ed and Minnie's lights were on inside of the house. Mike remembered thinking that this was unusual because they typically did not get up that early. Now, again, police were still skeptical, but Dennis actually confirmed this story and Mike's version of events. He confirmed that Mike was with him that morning at work. Mike then took a polygraph test in regards to the murders and he passed it. So because of the alibi and because of the polygraph, police had to eliminate Mike as a potential suspect, and they were back to the drawing board in their investigation. But sadly, police really had no other leads left to turn to at this time. There really was no real movement in this case, so because of that, years had passed, 7 years to be exact. The police department at the time of the murder consisted of 4 detectives and a sergeant, so there weren't as many resources that could go into solving this case, even though all resources that they had did, and that didn't mean that the effort wasn't there. 7 years after the murders, detectives went back to go through old case files, and that is when they reopened the case of Ed and Minnie. They reread all of the tips that they received, and one tip in particular caught their eye. And this time, they got a tip from someone who encouraged police to speak to a woman named Robin Rife. Robin Rife was the estranged wife of Rick Rife. Rick and his brother Greg were very well known in law enforcement. They were incredibly close, and they very much did not have a good reputation around Ethel. It was said that everyone was afraid of the Reif brothers. And if anyone said that they weren't afraid, that they were just flat out lying. These two were known to be involved in drugs and assaults. They were known to just be very aggressive people. They were also known to always be complaining about money and not having enough of it and always trying to figure out how to make more money. They were also known as the drug dealers in the community. They overall were just not great people. Now, in 1992, again, 7 years after the murders, police decided that they wanted to speak with the Reif brothers. However, that is when they learned that the Reif brothers actually moved to Alaska in 1987, which was just 2 years after the murders, and no one had heard from them since. So in order to get in touch with the Reif brothers, police figured their best bet was to get in touch with Robin. Now, in doing this, they actually learned that at this time, Robin was in jail serving time for a drug-related charge in Arizona. So police had to get in contact with Robin's caseworker, and through that, detectives were able to get on a phone call with Robin. Now, while on the phone with Robin, the detective told her that they were contacting her regarding a double homicide in Lewis County. And according to the detective, Robin immediately, without hesitation, responded with, quote unquote, "You mean the two old people." Now, this instantly gave detectives the confirmation that they were looking for to tell them that Robin knew exactly what they were talking about. Robin then went on to say, quote unquote, "I only dropped them off," which then told police even more that not only did she have knowledge about the case, but it's very possible that Robin was involved to some extent. Robin went on to say that on December 18th, the day before the murders, she had actually dropped off Rick and Greg about a mile away from where the Morans lived. The next morning, she said that she got a call from Greg asking her to come pick him up at the location that he provided, which was where Ed and Minnie's bodies were later discovered. Robin then said she did what Greg had asked and she drove over to that location, but when she got there and Rick saw her there, Rick started yelling at Greg and telling him to get Robin out of there, so then she left. Now, even though you might think that this statement might be enough to go through with an arrest on the Reif brothers, it really wasn't, because due to Robin's history and her criminal record, the DA at the time did not feel confident going through with these charges based solely off of Robin's testimony. It's very circumstantial and it really is just one person saying something. So because of that, the case fell cold again. Now, detectives did say that they continued to call Robin every couple months. They would talk about the case and really just touch base with her to keep that communication going in the hopes that they could potentially go through with these charges in the future. But in 1995, when detectives tried to get a hold of her, that is when they learned that Robin actually had passed away after a complication from a heart surgery that she had. Now, this came as a complete shock to authorities, but what this also meant was now the only eyewitness in this case was dead, which meant that it was going to be even more difficult to try and get this case solved. So, years and years had passed again. In 2009, this case was handed over to a new detective, Detective Bruce Kimmey, and he decided that since he couldn't speak to Robin directly, he wanted to go to someone who was very close to her. So that is why Detective Kimmey reached out to Robin's sister. Now, when Kimmey had asked Robin's sister about the murder, her sister said that on Christmas 1985, Robin, Rick, and their kids came over to Robin's sister's house to celebrate. And Robin's sister said that this Christmas in particular looked very different than Christmases in the past. Robin's sister explained that prior to the murders, whenever she saw Robin, Rick, and their kids, they never looked well kept. They never looked clean. They were never wearing great clothes. They never had any type of Christmas presents that they were bringing to the celebration. But this Christmas in particular was very different. Robin's sister said that when the family showed up to their house, they all looked extremely put together. They were all dressed in very nice clothes. They brought over a ton of gifts. Rick also brought over several drugs for this Christmas celebration. He brought over marijuana, cocaine, and again, meth, and all of this stood out for a multitude of reasons. The first being that this had never happened before. They had never presented themselves in such a way, and it definitely stood out. But along with this, it stood out because Rick was not working at the time. For someone who was constantly complaining about not having enough money, he never had a job. So there were questions about where the money was coming from for not only the clothes that they were wearing, but also all of these gifts that they were providing and the drugs that Rick had. Robin's sister also said that Rick had made a comment that specific Christmas asking if gunshot pellets were traceable, which she did think was very odd at the time, but everyone just kind of brushed it off as just a weird question, and Rick never really pushed on it, so everyone just kind of, again, brushed over it. Now, when police were taking a moment to look at who Greg and Rick were associated with, this is when they found a friend of the brothers named Les George. Now, Robin actually pointed out Les in one of the phone calls that she had with detectives, and police were able to get in contact with Les himself and ask him several questions. And Les did tell detectives that one day prior to Ed and Minnie's murder, he was actually driving in the car with Greg and Rick, who were complaining about not having enough money, and Les told them that if they were looking for money, that Ed and Minnie had quite a bit of it. Les said that this got brought up because they were actually passing Ed and Minnie's house at that exact time, and it just clicked with Les in that moment. Oh, Ed and Minnie also have a lot of money. Les also mentioned that a week prior to the murders, Rick had offered to shave down one of Les's guns. Les had a gun that was too big for him because he wanted it small enough to keep in his truck for protection, and Rick had offered to shave it down for him, but Les remembered that it was very difficult to get his gun back from Rick, and it wasn't until after the murders had occurred that Rick returned the gun to him. Les remembered that he had a bad feeling when he got the gun back. He just knew that something wasn't quite right. So he put the gun in a closet at his parents' house. And apparently, his parents had such a bad feeling about this gun also that Les's father actually took the gun and threw it into the river, and police were never able to locate it. Again, this was decades after the murder at this point. So police were not able to locate that gun. So with all of this compiling information, police were finally able to get arrest warrants on July 8th of 2012 for both Greg and Rick Rife. Now, the day that those arrest warrants were signed was the same day that police learned that 1 week prior, Greg had actually died in Alaska. Now, this was obviously a gut punch to police because this meant that Greg was never going to be held accountable for his actions. He was never going to be held accountable for what he did to Ed and Minnie, but that did not mean that Rick couldn't be. Police in Lewis County ended up flying down to Alaska and drove to Rick Rife's home alongside the Alaskan authorities. Now, when Rick saw police at his home, he acted very confused, and he continuously was asking police what they were doing there, what they wanted, and he actually invited them inside to have a conversation. Now, one of the first things that police noticed about Rick was obviously he was much older at this point. Many, many years had passed since 1985. We're looking at 2012 now. He was much older. He didn't seem to be in the best of health. He had some breathing problems. But along with all of that, when police informed Rick why they were there, he adamantly denied having any involvement in the murders whatsoever. Now, regardless, police did not believe him, and they went through with the arrest. Police remembered that Rick's only response to being arrested was saying, "I guess I'm going to need my medications." Now, up until this point, all of the evidence against Rick was circumstantial, but that was about to change. After the arrest of Rick, there was actually a resident of Ethel, Washington, and a friend of Minnie and Ed's. This friend's name was Jason Shriver. Now, Jason Shriver came forward after Rick's arrest with some pretty damning information, and he told police what he knew. Jason said that on December 19th of 1985, so the day of the murders, he was actually on his way to the dentist with his mom to get his wisdom teeth taken out. And as him and his mom were driving along the road, he actually passed Ed and Minnie in their car. Now, Jason said that something seemed very off about this because Ed was in the front seat of the car driving. However, Minnie was in the back seat, and that already was very strange, but they weren't alone in the car. Jason said that he saw Rick in the passenger seat of the car and Greg sitting next to Minnie in the back. Now, Jason said that he was 17 years old at this time. He waved to Minnie and Ed in their car, thinking that they would wave back. However, they never did. Jason then said that several days after the murder, Rick and Greg tracked Jason down. They drove into town and figured out where he was. And Jason, who again was 17 years old at this time, got cornered by Rick and Greg, who began threatening Jason. Rick and Greg told Jason that if he ever told anybody about what he saw with Rick and Greg being in the car with Ed and Minnie, not only would they kill him, but they would kill his family as well. Jason said that they instilled fear into him by driving by his family home every single day until they moved to Alaska. And again, this was a tactic to instill fear and intimidate Jason. And Jason said that over the years, he did try and reach out to police, but nothing ever came of it. Jason also has spoken about the immense guilt that he feels about all of this. He felt like he could have done more for Ed and Minnie, and that's something that he very much struggles with. Truthfully, I can't even imagine having that burden on you and having to think that way and just having all of these feelings of guilt. So a little over a year after the arrest, in November of 2013, this case did go to trial. The star witness for the prosecution was Jason Shriver, and the prosecution really painted this picture of Rick and Greg going into the Morin home on the early morning hours of December 19th, thinking that Ed and Minnie had cash inside of the house. But when they got there and realized there wasn't any, that is when they had to drive to the bank later that morning and take the cash out. And Ed had to be the one to do that. Now, it is believed that after they took the cash out that morning, they then headed into the woods and killed Ed and Minnie. Afterwards, they believe that both Rick and Greg drove the car to the Yardbirds parking lot where they left it. Now, after the jury had deliberated, they found Rick guilty of 2 counts of murder in the first degree, 2 counts of first-degree kidnapping, and 1 count of first-degree robbery, and he was sentenced to 103 years in prison. And that, you guys, is the case of Ed and Minnie Morin. Now, again, like I said in the beginning, this case is absolutely heartbreaking. It's horrifying to think about what Ed and Minnie were thinking in the hours leading up to their death, how scared they must have felt, how worried they must have been. And it really just is a terrifying thought knowing that Rick and Greg took away such a pillar of the community of Ethel and a couple that everyone loved. Luckily, some form of justice was served. But I am very curious to hear what you guys have to say about this case, so definitely let me know in the comments below. And with that being said, you guys, that is going to be all for me today. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Killer Instinct. Again, if you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah. I'm your host of Killer Instinct. Make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That way you never miss an episode. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday. You're not going to want to miss it. We also upload the video version onto YouTube on Wednesdays as well, so make sure you are subscribed. I will be back next week with a brand new one for you guys. And until then, wait a second. Is today the last episode of 2024? It is. That is crazy. Merry Christmas, you guys. I will see you in 2025. And until then, stay safe. Bye, guys.